Hi. So in this lecture, we want to talk about patterns, right? So what are patterns? So patterns are basically a set of problems which you will be seeing very regularly in different kind of tests, different kind of places online. There'll be a lot of people talking about pattern problems as soon as they start learning how to code, right? So patterns are an amazing set of problems to practice loops, which you learned recently, right? So you already know how to loop, how to basically do some repetitive work multiple times, and we want to use that to basically apply those concepts on pattern problems. So what are pattern problems? So generally, what will happen is you will be given a pattern that you need to print. For example, a very simple pattern can be something like this. So I am asking you to print a 4 by 4 grid, right? It's a 4 cross 4 grid with all stars. You need to print this. So this is one set of pattern, one example of pattern. And this basically means if I had given you n is equals to 4, then you need to do this. If I had given you n is equals to 3, then you would have printed this pattern. So n cross n grid is something that you are supposed to print. Now similarly, they can be very different patterns. So for example, this is another pattern, right? So this is a pattern that is something that we'll be handling, that is something that we'll be looking at as well, that how to print patterns like these. Patterns can get really interesting. For example, I can ask you to print something like this, right? So again, this is a pattern. So I'm asking you to print 4 rows. So here n is equals to 4 and I'm asking you to print 4 rows. So what happens is, given any pattern, you need to spend some time figuring out what exactly is happening here. For example, here, if I give you these two examples and I ask you to write code for this, I think what you need to understand is, first of all, given n, I'm going to have n rows. So that's the first thing that you need to figure out. That's the first thing that should come to your head, that my pattern has n rows. Now once you've decided how many rows you have, now think of how to handle each individual row. So for example, here, every row is similar. Every row has n stars, not 4 stars, n stars. Why? Because if n was 3, you will have 3 stars and not 4 stars. So what are we saying? Each row has, you have n rows and each row has n columns. And what are you supposed to print in these columns? Every column is a star. So this is a very simple pattern. Here, each row is same as any other row. So you are supposed to print n rows. Each row has n columns and each column is a star, right? So things are very straightforward for you to handle it. But not all patterns will be that simple, right? But not all the patterns will be that simple. So for example, this pattern. Now, again, this is a pattern where if you have 4, you have 4 rows. So n rows. Now each row has n columns. That means the first row has 4 columns, second row has 4 columns, the third row has 4 columns, and so on. So if n was 3, what would this pattern look like? It would look like this. So each row has 3 columns. If n was 4, each row has 4 columns. So n rows, each row has n columns. But what do you need to print? Now that's a little more interesting than what you had here. Here you knew you have to print a star every time. But now you don't have to print a star every time. You need to print a number. And the number changes as you proceed in a row. So we'll have to figure out what to print. To me, it looks like we need to print the column number. In the first row, The first column is 1, second column is 2, third column is 3, fourth column is 4. In the second row, first column is 1, second column is 2, third column is 3, fourth column is 4. So basically you need to print the column number. That's how you can handle this pattern. Let's not worry about this pattern for now. We will look at a lot of patterns, and that will give us some idea how to handle patterns like these as well. In general, what you will have to figure out is, first of all, you will have to figure out how many rows do I need to print. So this is the first question you will have to answer. In most of the cases, this will be equal to n. Most of the cases, not always, but most of the times it will be equal to n. The second question you will have to answer is, how many columns does the ith row has? So what happens is, as soon as I have figured out I need to print n rows, I'll basically make a loop which looks something like this. This is my loop representing when I is 1, I want to print the first row. When I is 2, I want to print the second row. When I is 3, I want to print the third row, and so on. Right? Now, within here, I want to figure out how do I print. How do I print the ith row? A generic ith row. So if I can figure that out, what will happen is, when I is 1, first row will get printed. When I is 2, second row will get printed, and so on. So my problem will become very simple for me. So I need to worry about how many columns does the ith row has. Now the third thing will be what to print. That's the third thing you will have to figure out, right? That's the third problem that you will have to solve. As soon as you know the answer to all these three, your problem will be more or less sorted for you. Okay? So let's say I want to print this pattern. So first of all, you need to understand that whenever you are printing something while you are writing code, what happens is you go in this direction, right? So I can't say, hey, first print a star, then print this star, then come back and print this star. That's not possible. You print this way. Once you have reached this place, you cannot go back and print something. So you move left to right. Once you press an enter, you can't go back up. So effectively that means I need to first completely print the first row, because once I moved on to the second row, I can't come back and change anything in the first row. So basically my code is going to look something like this. As I said earlier, what's happening here? First of all, I will be 1, then I will be 2, then I will be 3, then I will be 4, and what that represents is when I is 1, I am printing the first row. Once the first row is done, then I is 2 and I am printing the second row. There is no way for me to go back to the first row anymore. Okay? So we always need to think in a way, first row, second row, third row, and that also has to happen left to right. Then we will be able to take care of everything. As I said, for every pattern, you need to think of three things: number of rows, number of columns, what to print, right? We will try to answer these three before we start writing code. We should have clarity on these three questions before we start writing our code. As soon as you have this clarity, writing code will become very, very easy, right? We will use a very standard template for printing patterns. So we'll have I is equals to 1, we will have while I less than equal to n, we will do something. Within here, I am not worried about the complete pattern. I am just worried about the ith row, right? If this code works for ith row, this will work for I is equals to 1, first row will get printed, then second row, then third row, and so on. Your pattern will be completely printed the way you want it. Okay, so that's a very typical format that we will be using for printing patterns. Perfect. So from the next session, we'll start looking at examples. We'll start working on these. We'll solve a lot of patterns throughout this lecture, and hopefully things will be absolutely clear and you'll be able to solve pattern problems by the end of the lecture. Okay, thank you.